And we'll go to this. So are we, well, let me just find out. Are we seeing that screen? If Louise, could you unmute for yourself for a second and tell me if the screen is being seen?
Yeah, you're saying very well.
Okay, great. Okay, there we are. We're going, now that we know everything there is to know about Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and the Ottoman Empire, we can learn about Saudi Arabia all in 30 minutes. Just suggesting how difficult it is to put all that together. But in the last lecture, we talked about Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, all of which became subject to the League of Nations mandate system at the end of the First World War. The mandate system was a system whereby European powers were assigned the control of certain areas to prepare them for independence. A cynic would say, and I would agree, actually, this was an attempt to continue the imperialism of an earlier period where the European powers had divvied up Africa and Asia, and now they had the Middle East in their hands. The problem arose that nationalism had made its way into the ideologies of local people, and you get things like the Great Syrian Revolt of 1925. The problem that the British had in Iraq, which had been called before the war Mesopotamia, and the British, quote, withdrew in 1930, but they're still around, and they're still controlling Egypt at this time, even though it's not a mandate. And what you have are this issue of multi-ethnic societies. That's the word that we use today, but to say that Sunni and Shiite are multi-ethnic, not quite, but they could be at daggers drawn. In many cases, they were different ways of interpreting Islam. This is complicated by the Kurdish population in Syria, Turkey, and Lebanon and Iraq. In Lebanon, by the Druze, we looked at them for a few minutes last time, and the Maronite Catholics, we looked at them. In Syria, you have the Alawites, another version of Islam, which is considered heretical by many Muslims. And in Iraq, you also have people who are called the Assyrians. They're Christians. Anyway, here's a map. This is the mandate for Syria and Lebanon. This whole area divided into various states. And you see the state of Damascus and the state of Aleppo. These are the two large cities that are the centers of these. And then you get over here in the purple and green, Lebanon. And they even talked about a Druze state at the time within Syria. We also talked about a little bit of the much more modern, this Iran-Iraq war, which was a continuation of old animosities and old desires, and the ongoing civil war in Syria and Lebanon, still going on in Syria and Lebanon. There's a quiet truce, but not a great situation. And we looked at, in a little more detail, at Iraq. Here you have the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that we all learn is one of the cradles of Western civilization. Now in an area that is really in contention. Mosul up here, this is a Kurdish area that the Kurds are trying to claim for themselves. Today we'll look at Saudi Arabia as the one other country that emerges from the old Ottoman Empire. And this is a little different in that there's no mandate, there's nobody wants the place at the time. The Arabian Peninsula in 1920 is seen as a place with a desert, a few oases. We don't know how many people were there because they didn't take any census. We don't know where they lived. We don't know what the largest city was. And yet today, Saudi Arabia, because of its oil power, is a major player on the international scene. So just to orient you a bit, here's Riyadh, which is the capital of Saudi Arabia. Mecca and Medina, the holy cities of Islam, are here on the closer to the Red Sea. And these other smaller principalities, sultanates, whatever you want to call them, that become important because of their oil supplies. Kuwait, we had the war in 1991. We have Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates. We didn't go into any detail, but they're there, all on the borders of Saudi Arabia, and we'll see that it's more than just oil that separates these countries. So you might ask the question, if the British were trying to grab everything after the First World War, why didn't they take control? Well, difficult place to control, and they didn't see any point to it, even though they had encouraged someone known as the Sharif, with one R, of Mecca, over here during the war, to start what was called, quote, the Arab Revolt. And then the American journalist, later Lowell Thomas, made T.E. Lawrence famous as Lawrence of Arabia. But, and Lawrence was a British Army captain, but Britain wasn't all that interested. This area is called the Hejaz down here. And we have, as I mentioned, the Sharif of Mecca, the Arab Revolt of 1916. And remember, Mecca and Medina are crucial cities in Islam. That Muhammad emerges in Mecca. Later, at one point, he's forced to flee the Hijra to Medina. Later comes back and conquers Mecca. And these are the two holy cities where you have the annual pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia, which is very important in Islam. I assume that most of you have seen something about that. The third city of Islam is Jerusalem, for various reasons, and we won't deal with that right now. And we have talked about it a little bit, but here it is up here, not that far away in distance, very far away in politics, economics, ideology, and so on. I should mention that Mecca and Medina had been acquired by the Ottomans in 1517. So for 400 years, this was part of the Ottoman Empire. But World War I came and things changed. We had this, someone who took over as king, Abd al-Saud. All administration is in the hands of King Abd al-Aziz al-Saud. His Majesty is bound by the laws of the Sharia. Well, we don't know quite what that means. And we'll talk about it a little bit in a few minutes. But I should say about the Saudis, they took over Saudi Arabia. The Sheriff of Mecca was from a different family who wanted to be the king of Syria. He didn't get that. He got Iraq as a booby prize. And here you see 1916 to 1918, there was this so-called Arab army, and they created their own flag, and they got a lot of publicity, and they did some guerrilla warfare against the Turks. But in addition, you have something called the Ikhwan. Now, the Ikhwan appeared in 1902, and they are, depending on your point of view, soldiers of Islam, nomadic raiders, bandits, whatever you want to say, but up in northern Saudi Arabia, they're really there. And in the 1920s, they come into conflict with Ibn Saud. Here's a image of the cavalry of the Ikhwan. Could be pretty devastating. They were very effective in desert fighting. And what Ibn Saud found is that, wait 1 second, I'm sorry. I'm Okay, what Ibn Saud found was that the Ikhwan was out of control. And the only way he found to deal with them was really to massacre them, to kill them. And I must say that this is not unheard of. If you might remember from another course that the Ottoman Sultan massacred the Janissaries in 1826. They were just out of control. And the only way he could deal with them is to kill them. You have the Mamluks in Egypt. Same thing happened to them. Going back in history, you think Peter the Great slaughtered the Imperial Guard, because once these groups become institutionalized, they're very difficult to control. So 1932, with the Ikhwan eliminated, you have the formation of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And what happens later? Oil. We all know about oil. And the question is, who's going to control oil? You know, they knew about oil earlier in Iraq. They didn't know about it in Saudi Arabia. It's only 1938, 1940 that it was discovered in Saudi Arabia. I'm having a problem with my computer. I'm going to stop sharing and start sharing. I'm going to start share again. Okay, sorry. Anyway, if you look at this map, you see these dark spots? These are the, well, they call them supergiant oil fields. Well, giant and supergiant, it sounds like a breakfast cereal. But you can see that this stuff, first of all, it's in eastern Saudi Arabia, not over here where the holy city. The holy city's over here. This stuff is in the center near the coast. And it says that Kuwait has oil here, Qatar, and of course there's Iran, with not shown on this map. Here's oil up here in the Kurdish area. This is how the Kurds till now have been able to maintain themselves. They have the pumping oil, and the Iraqi central government is not happy about that. If you look at oil now, just to give you an idea of what's happened in Saudi Arabia, look at these pipelines. I mean, this stuff goes to a lot of places. At one point, it went up to Lebanon, but it's not used. But here, Basra, we read about that. We read about these ports here on the Persian Gulf. There's even a Yemen port, although there's a problem with the civil war in Yemen. So this is something that gives you an idea of the development of the Saudi economy. It's been called a rentier economy. That is to say, they live on these rents, and for a long time didn't develop anything else, which is really, for a society, not a very healthy way of developing. What it does is, what you see, it concentrates power in the few families or organizations, and it prevents the development of other areas of the economy and society. I'll give you one more map about oil. #1 world exporter, Saudi Arabia. Now, and then #2, by the way, you see is Russia, and followed by the US and Canada. The point is, though, that even if you have a number, say like 2.0 millions of barrels a day, that might be only 25% of Saudi Arabia. That's a big number. And you see it here: Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Iraq. These are the Middle Eastern countries supplying a good portion of the world's oil. And of course, there are other areas, and every one of those areas tries to use it as a political tool. So we know that in the 1970s, OPEC oil, but I forgot what it is, something exporting countries, why O&P, oil and petroleum, in there somewhere. oil becomes a major tool in international politics, and Saudi Arabia is right in the middle of this. So from a country that in the 1920s wasn't a country, we didn't know how many people there were, we didn't know what cities were there, hardly anybody knew where it was. 1970s, it's a kingpin. And you got the development of the Saudi royal household. You know, you often read about a Saudi prince. Well, you got 20,000 members of that family. So it's not as though it's a close-knit cousin circle. And the royal family has a lot of competition within it, as you might imagine. King Saud was deposed. I can't remember the date, but in 1975, King Faisal was murdered. And then in 1979, protesters seized the Grand Mosque in Mecca. That was very traumatic for the government when that happened. And here you have a picture of some of the insurgents who were grabbed afterwards. It was not treated. They didn't have a great time after they were captured. Then in 1982, King Fahd comes in and he supported the U.S. and Kuwait in 1991. This was quite controversial in the Arab world, although a number of countries did support the U.S. except for the PLO. PLO got in a lot of trouble by supporting Saddam Hussein. But in Saudi Arabia, we have some mild reforms in 2005. And even now, you know, you can read women may be able to drive a car, perhaps, but they get involved on the international scene in a war in Yemen, heavily Shiite conflict with the dominant Sunni rulers in Yemen, and Saudi Arabia is very much involved in that war. So if you look back at the turning points in the history of Saudi Arabia, I guess I left off point number one, which was the discovery of oil. That really is around 1940 or so. But then in 1967, we have Saudi Arabia and its allies. Egypt in 1967 was defeated very soundly by Israel, and it had to withdraw its forces from North Yemen. And that's where the Saudis tried to take their place. In 1973, following the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, sorry, you have oil prices go sky high and OPEC is formed. And then by the 1980s, Saudi Arabia becomes the largest oil producer in the world. So you get these events, which really say a lot of what's happening in the Middle East and with a great effect on Saudi Arabia. In the late 1970s, there's an Islamic revolution in Iran, and it's led by Islamic ideologues who are Shiites. Shiites are really at daggers drawn, as I said, with the Sunni in many areas. Then in 1979, the mosque, Grand Mosque, is seized by fundamentalists. Then you have the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s, where Saudi Arabia then becomes a supporter of the locals to the point where they want locals out, and the Taliban sort of comes out of Saudi Arabia. And then in the 1980s, you get this Iran-Iraq war. We talked a little bit about that last week. A terrible conflict, child soldiers on each side, indiscriminate bombings. It was pretty bad. So it's sort of an armed truce now, with Iraq continuing to claim that Iran is trying to interfere by supporting Shiite forces within Iraq and in Saudi Arabia. And you have an ongoing civil war in Yemen. And child soldiers are not just in Iran, Iraq. This is a really disheartening picture that I ran across. Child soldiers in Yemen, terrible. Let's look at Islam first, because when you talk about Saudi Arabia, you really need to refer to Islam. And if we look at Islam, its existence around the world, And we see it over here. Here's West Africa, moving, this is Sahara's in here, and there's not as strong in sub-Saharan Africa. But in here in North Africa, a whole series of countries that are heavily Muslim, like Nigeria, there's Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Sudan. This is Somaliland and Ethiopia. Then here is Saudi Arabia, which we've been talking about, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and then Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia. By the way, Indonesia is the country with the largest Muslim population in the world. And don't let these colors deceive you in the sense that here you have heavily, deeply purple for Shiite. That doesn't mean that there are no Shiites in other countries, that there are no Sunnis in Iran. But this is just to give you an idea of where they are dominant. Here's Iran and part of Iraq, and every place else you see a dominance of Sunni Islam, but it's not one or the other in any one country. If we look at Islam a little more closely, where do Sunnis and Shia live in South Asia and the Middle East? So now we say mostly Shia, not completely Shia. We have, well, North Yemen, these are these rebels we just talked about in the Civil War. Shiites in Lebanon and Syria, and we know about Hezbollah, the guerrilla group, and then Iran, of course, in parts of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a very large Shiite population. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. It's not as though this fundamentalist form of Islam is from the Sunni side is all over Saudi Arabia. There are a lot of Shiites here. Iraq itself is riven by different groups, Sunni, Shiite, Assyrians, Kurds. And in Iran, I don't know if you realize that Iran is a multi-ethnic state. It's not as though they're all Iranians. You look, and you have all these Shiites, of course, but you get a lot of Arabs. If we define Iranians as those who speak Persian, then we got a lot of Arabs. We have a split between Sunnis and Shiites. So it's a very complicated picture of the Middle East. And here you have these little spots of Shiites in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan, Afghanistan, in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. So, I've veered off from talking about just about Saudi Arabia into talking about Islam, because Islam has become such a controversial item in Western society. You have, take our own American society, we have a number of mosques, and we have American Muslims are in the main considered moderate and not in conflict with the major society. But you have a country like France, which has more and more defining Islam or Muslims as an enemy. It makes it very uncomfortable for them, although there are many Muslims in France. So what is Islam? It's this religion. It's called an Abrahamic religion, along with Judaism and Christianity. It sees its history in that. And it's based on Sharia, which is a term that gets bandied about, and we don't quite know what it means, because you have all these Islamic fundamentalists who are saying we want to reinstitute the rule of Sharia, or institute the rule of Sharia in our society. The Taliban talks about it in Afghanistan, you see it in Saudi Arabia, you hear it in North Africa. But what is Sharia? It's different in different places. There's traditionally it's seen as four sources. One is from the Quran. The word is spelled many ways, and I just give you this image of the Quran here. Then there are authentic sayings or rules that come out of from Islamic scholars. We have analogical reasoning, that is, if A is allowed, then B should be allowed. And then there's a judicial consensus that there are Islamic scholars, used to be mainly in Egypt, now they're in many places. But it's an issue of, what is Sharia? And if you look at this little thing here, a lot of it has to do with rituals of worship, a small percentage penal laws, and a large percentage of family and economic laws. No usury, for example, or no interest, actually, and the ways around it. And if you think about this, I was struck in looking at this, how similar in many ways this is to the Talmudic tradition in Judaism. That is, you have a set of rules and commandments that look into many facets of everyday life. And it's different in different countries. We think about these traditional Islamic societies being very repressive of women, which they are, but women have different roles in different Islamic societies. So Muslim women in America or in, let's say, in Bosnia, or even in Turkey, are really very different from the position that women have in Saudi Arabia. And everybody says they're relying on Sharia. Well, you have different judges and different interpretations and different ways of life. So you have an interaction between the society and the rules put down by the Sharia. So it's not just the Quran. It's like, it's like you have Christian fundamentalists in the United States saying, well, we're going back to the way the Bible told us to act. Well, of course, the Bible doesn't tell you how to act in many, many cases. And the same goes for the Quran. And then people will talk about the Sharia or Quran having some vicious things that talk about cutting off hands of thieves or stoning people. Well, the Jewish Christian Bible has an eye for an eye. We don't do those things. So it depends on the interpretation and how it's applied. And I go into all of this because, as I said, I can't possibly deal with all of Saudi Arabia in the short time that we have. And I did want to take something very characteristic and talk about Sharia here, just as we talked about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or about the Ba'ath Party in Syria. I'm talking about Sharia here and the role of Islam in Saudi Arabia. And it's an interesting comparison. If you look at the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which sometimes is political, sometimes not, they're talking about setting up a true Muslim society, but we don't know exactly what that is. When President Morsi was elected in Egypt in 2011, his administration was initially very much a corrupt administration because he appointed all his buddies from the Muslim Brotherhood. Or if you look at, let's say, the Gaza Strip, where you have Hamas, which is a Sunni organization, it's really a dictatorship of this military group. Maybe they see it as demanded by the situation with Israel and with Egypt, but it's still a society that says it has allegiance to Sharia. So there's an issue here. And when I say what is Sharia, I can tell you I don't know, and I'm not sure that you'll get any one answer from anybody. So it's a real issue. Oops, I didn't want to do that yet. I got to go backward. Can I ask for comments or questions here before we go on? Just unmute yourself. I'm having some issues in receiving things here. Okay, well, if you think of it, you can send me a chat. We'll go on. I wanted to point out that Islam is not all political, that there's a strong cultural component. Now, this is an exhibit that's going on right now. It's in Paris, and it's going to go to Dallas afterwards. So it was a joint exhibit called, it's in Paris, it's the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, the Museum of Decorative Arts, and it's about the French collector Jacques Cartier and the arts of Islam, talking about the sources of modernity. And I just pulled a few pictures of some of the items that are being shown in this exhibit, how interesting they are. You know, here's a head ornament, a box. I was amused, this was called in French a pyxide. So I looked up pyxide in the dictionary, and the translation of pyxide is pyxis. It was, I didn't find that a helpful translation. It refers to a cosmetic box usually, and that's what you see here with these very ornate decorations. I was just fascinated by this, but it's not just these artifacts. Here you have a portrait of Fakhr Ali Shah from Iran. Look, if you look at the art from Iran, in particular, you get lots of representations of the human figure. You know, we always read, well, the Islam does not allow representation of human figure. Well, there you are. This guy, it's, you know, it's Shiite, so you see more. You certainly see it from the Shiite tradition in Persia. Lots of pictures of the human figure, and now there's a beard to be admired or astonished by. But this is one of the paintings in this exhibit. If any of you are going to Paris in the next few months, you might consider this. It's interesting from the catalog of the exhibition. I'll read this to you. Though the critique of Orientalism by Edward Said remains fundamental, and I want to remind you, we talked about Edward Said in the very first class, and I've mentioned him several times. He has had an enormous impact on the way people look at things in the Middle East and in Muslim countries. So though the critique of Orientalism by Edward Said remains fundamental, many recent studies and exhibits have contributed to showing how the arts of Islam have passed from the status of a passive object to the study of the active object of an encounter. The point is that instead of Islam or the Middle East or these countries being the object of attention, here you have in the collections based on this Cartier family, how Islam influenced what happened in the West. That is, the influence is going the other way. I don't think that Said will have a book called Occidentalism, but this is a case of the impact going in a different direction. And I found that to be very interesting. So that's the end of Saudi Arabia for what I can say. You know, what are you going to say in 35 minutes? But I wanted to review some of the things we've talked about for the past 6 weeks. Here you have, at the end of the First World War, a continuation of imperialism as I see it. On the far right, there's David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill. Looks like it's before Churchill went. He was on a diet at the time. You know, we see him as a hugely fat guy. And in the middle, three of the big players at the Versailles Peace Conference: Georges Clemenceau from France, David Lloyd George from England, and Vittorio Orlando from Italy. The one missing is Woodrow Wilson, who had quite an impact, even though he was pretty ineffectual as a negotiator. I should point out, by the way, that in the mandate system, there was a lot of talk of the US taking a mandate over Armenia. And I think it's to the luck of the Americans they didn't. But there were at the time the formation of new nationalities in all these countries. There's the Orientalism, and there is Pan-Arabism that later, we didn't talk about this in this course, but in the middle of the 20th century, there was the talk of Pan-Arabism, that there's something that holds Arabs together. Of course, as soon as they tried it, they find that it's a little exaggerated. One example will be the failure of the United Arab Republic with Egypt and Syria in the 1958 to early 60s. But in the dismantling the Ottoman Empire, we look, these are these countries that start to come out. First of all, in the 19th century, in the European and the Western side, these countries are peeled off. Egypt, which is, it's nominally part of the empire, but it's not really. Greece becomes independent in the 1820s. Romania in the 1860s, Bulgaria 1870s, Bosnia-Herzegovina is annexed in 1908. So in 1829, before this start, 19th century, look at the spread of the Ottoman Empire. It's not just Turkey over here, but you see Greece, Macedonia, parts of what are now Romania, North Africa, all through here. We have Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Egypt. Here's the Hejaz. We talked about that part of what's now Saudi Arabia. Oops, I didn't do that. Someone was trying to grab my screen and I kicked them out. Cliff, please stop trying to take control of the screen. Do not do it. So the Ottoman Empire is there. Then look at how these countries emerge. By the time of the First World War, you have all these independent countries. We didn't talk about any of these in this course, but they're coming off the Ottoman Empire. And so you're probably more familiar with this geography, I suspect, than the Middle East. But here, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Greece, Albania, Montenegro, and there's the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's trying to grab things here. Then in 1920, look at that. Here's with the vestige of the Ottoman Empire. Set up under the Treaty of Lausanne, 1922. And here's where you get Turkey, a little bit of European Turkey here. We have, going into what's now the border with Armenia. We talked about the Armenian massacres, and this is where the Armenians were concentrated, although there were Armenians everywhere in the Ottoman Empire. And if you recall, we talked about the 40 days of Musadag, and those people eventually got down here to be rescued by a French cruiser. Between two world wars, here's a cartoon of the problem of the League of Nations. It sort of makes the U.S. central, and that was Woodrow Wilson's dream of the League of Nations. But here's England. Japan is trying to control China and Korea. European nations are trying to get a hold of their mandates. I'm not sure what the cartoon means by foreign nations. We've covered the rest of the world here. So in Turkey, again, as a review, we talked about Gallipoli in 1915. Ataturk, the man who becomes Ataturk, right here, becomes famous. In 1924, Ataturk, father of his country. But what's the legacy beside that Turkey? We have a problem. Authoritarian rule was the rule. Very corrupt. It did have a certain amount of religious tolerance, which unfortunately has not been maintained. If you recall, we had the Ottoman Empire had the millet system, which allowed religious minorities to become sort of self-ruled as long as they paid their taxes. And so even though they were inferior in position, they had a decent position. This is true of the Christians and the Jews in particular in the Ottoman Empire. But here is what became of the countries of the Ottoman Empire. As I said, Egypt had more or less broken off already, but we have Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. It wasn't clear who controlled Yemen before. It wasn't really in the empire. But that's what the Middle East now looks like. And it was set up in 1922, with the exception of Israel and Palestine. That's the one issue that went on to after the Second World War. I mean, we've had wars, Iran versus Iraq, we have Yemen, but these are the kind of borders that are seen now today. So why are these governments stable or not stable? They're starting to come to some definition of what is a stability, what do we mean by stability? And I like to offer the definition of stability as being a country that has elections that are more or less free, and the losing party turns over power to its successor. Doesn't make them democratic, makes them more stable. So who in the Middle East qualifies for this? In particular, Israel, for all the problems that it has in terms of dealing with the Palestinians and the bad press that it gets. It is a stable government that when one party loses, it steps out of office and another party comes in. When this happens in, say, in Iraq, you're practically, you have armed groups really debating what's going to happen. Turkey, since the 1990s, has been stable and went through a whole series of military coups. And we will see what happens if Erdogan loses more elections. Will he step down? The hope for Turkish stability is that he will, but we don't know yet. So if you look at these countries, stability is a tough issue. As I say, Turkey since the 1990s, Israel has since 1948 been stable with this definition, but Syria's in a civil war. As we know, Lebanon, they had an agreement in 1943, which we talked about among the Sunni, the Shiite, the Druze, the Christians, but it's an armed camp. Iraq, I don't have to give you the detail, it's a terrible situation after Saddam Hussein and the conquest by US-led powers that has not settled down to anything peaceful. Saudi Arabia is not a country with free elections, as was part of my definition of a stable government. It's stable in the sense that the royal family is there, but it's still an issue. All of these countries have faced the issue of economic development being constrained by population growth. Remember, we looked at it, the numbers in Egypt that went from, I've forgotten what it was in around 1920, and the 20 or 30 million, over 100 million people there now. I mean, no, you can have, if you have economic growth, you've got to also be able to do more than just feed your population. It's a terrible problem for these countries. And if you look at the refugee question in Europe and some of the United States, this is an issue of overpopulation. I mean, that's what's happening. It goes back to, the Roman Empire and the, quote, barbarians trying to enter the empire because they could not survive elsewhere. So today we're seeing it with refugees. We're leaving the United States out because we're dealing with Latin America there. But if you look at Europe, these are refugees from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from Syria, from North Africa. Many of these countries are remnants of the old, not remnants, but left over from the Ottoman Empire. In fact, one peaceful immigration occurred in the 1960s and 70s when Germany was in terrible need of unskilled or low-skilled workers, and they started bringing in Turks. Well, a large number of Turks live in Germany, and many of them have finally, after I've forgotten, relatively recently, dual citizenship has been allowed. But many Turks have been successful in becoming part of a German middle class. There's a lot of poverty, but there's a strong element of, in parliament, there are Turks, in the professions and the universities. So that's part of that out-migration, which is really part of the modern world. It's the flip side of improved public health. We got a lot of people and we don't know how to house them. The old Thomas Malthus in the end of the 18th century said that population can be controlled by positive measures such as famine or other natural disasters. He called it, quote, positive. And our technology has put off some of those issues, but the technology is not infinite. And we have a serious population issue, and they're going to Europe because they think that's where jobs are. At the same time, you get this civil war in a lot of these countries. Take Egypt. Egypt's not in civil war, but it's had several military coups in the last 20 years. Saudi Arabia is panicked over Shiite unrest, and it's involved in Yemen, supporting Sunnis against Shiites. Iraq, of course, is a basket case. Iran does not admit its problems. We don't know much about it, but I'm convinced that these population issues are very significant. And Turkey itself, was seen with the rise of Erdogan, has a case of rural versus urban. Erdogan drawing his strength from the rural, more traditional communities against the more urbanized Turkish society. And there's no civil war in Turkey, but you do have Kurdish rebellion, and really a very vicious attempt to put down the Kurds. You haven't talked about Kurds much. They don't have their own country, but they're sure there over, all through here. This is Kurdish land. And finally, we have religion in the Middle East. It's a political and national question. We like to bandy about the term multi-ethnic in American society, and it can't quite apply that to Sunnis and Shiites because at least many of them are Arabs, not all. But they're the same, quote, ethnic group, but they're at odds with each other. And religion has become a serious political question with terrific, very important consequences. That is the end of my slides. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back. I hope that some people, we have 10 more minutes. It would be nice if some people had some kind of comments, questions, or something to add to this really very intricate question of the Middle East, both politics, economics, population growth.
Yeah, Alice Lee has a question.
My husband and I were invited by Prince Abdulaziz back as soon as Saudi Arabia received its oil that was prospering. I think it was in the 80s. That was our first trip there. He was awarded a big medal for doctoring and ophthalmology and so forth. But my big question is two things. One, Riyadh had no slums because Prince Abdulaziz and all the family kept everybody in good stead financially. And two, the women had a definite play or role in what was happening in many of these countries. When I was there, they couldn't drive. They had to wear abayas. It was really tough. And I think the women, when we would fly out of Riyadh back to Paris or wherever we were flying, the women would get on a plane and take off their abayas and wear short skirts and plenty of jewelry. but I'm just saying the women had a very tough time. And I found out from one of the families there that one of the women talked to a man on a street, and it was reported to her father. And her father said, "Daughter, meet me tomorrow at the swimming pool at 10 a.m. She met him and he drowned her. I mean, that's what we're talking about. So that's another factor in all of this Ottoman, whatever.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are aware that women have a very difficult position in fundamentalist Islamic societies. And you've given this. I'm not sure if everybody heard this, but one of the comments was how, in the end, there's sort of a honor murder. A father killed his daughter because she talked to a man in the street. You hear other things where brothers killing their sisters for what they consider inappropriate behavior. But it depends on the country and on the kind of Islam that is dominant. It just isn't the case in every society. I was trying to make the point that Islam is varied. It's not a monolith. And that and this ties into this question that I got from Neville here. What is the Islam or Sharia promoted by the madrasas exported from Saudi Arabia? Well, madrasa being, quote, a school, but it's really a school where you memorize the Quran. It's not a school in the sense of learning foreign languages or science or math or any of those other things. Saudi Arabia has become an exporter of a fundamentalist Islam that it sees as the way of Islam. And it is tied into social unrest. So, for example, Bosnia, which had a very moderate form of Islam, once that civil war broke out and you get this vicious attacks against Muslims, and the Muslims became a national form of identity, emissaries from Saudi Arabia began to find response in that society because this Islamic fundamentalism was very appealing to them. And then you have these madrasas that are created, and you have these guys coming out. It happened in Pakistan, Afghanistan, that when you have someone with a lot of money, like Saudi Arabia, supporting this, they're turning out people who are able to feed on social unrest. So what is the Islam or Sharia being promoted? Well, the Sharia is that part which emphasizes some of that position of women that was just described.
How about oil? How does oil fit into all this?
Well, oil creates what's been called a rentier economy. That is, instead of developing a varied economy, you have a lot of money flowing in without doing a hell of a lot. And oil is the, quote, the engine that drives us. Now, Saudi Arabia very recently has gotten religion, so to speak. They want to develop other kinds of industries. But oil is economic power, and it's poison for a society. So that's how I see the issue of oil. It just has prevented two things. It has prevented the growth of a varied society, and secondly, it's given power to small groups. They can control the economy. In this case, in Saudi Arabia, it's the royal family, and it has other effects. If you look at the Kurds, one of the ways that they have continued to support their revolt against the Iraqi government is to take control of the oil fields in northern Iraq. So when they have that income, they're able to fight. And the same thing goes for Iran. Why is Iran still successful? It's able to sell its oil. So unless we were to turn the world into solar power, we're going to be with that for a while.
I have another question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I'm saying so many things, but I just want to say that of all the countries, Jordan is one that I'm very interested in. I think the King of Jordan is a very fine, wonderful person. And I wonder how that fits in with the rest of the countries you're talking about.
Yeah, well, Jordan is an interesting example of a kind of a constitutional monarchy. You have a king who still appoints the major players, but you also have a parliament with relatively free elections. The problem that Jordan has had, and we don't know what the future will be, is that there are two segments of the population. One is, it started off Transjordan, and Jordan was a big Bedouin population who have now become more urbanized. But then after the war of 1948 with Israel, you got a huge Palestinian population. So you still have those two elements in there, the Palestinians and the Bedouins, and you still have the tradition of families which become clans and tribes who are vying for power. Now, Jordan has been lucky to have now a king who's been able to maintain the peace. But you keep reading about unrest, and can those parties continue to coexist, both internally, and is there an effect from the outside? For a long time, up until the late 1970s, the Palestinians were really a destabilizing factor, and they were this Palestinian movement, not the Palestinians, but the Palestinian political movement was driven out of Jordan, which gave Jordan several decades of social peace. But just like any other country, the jury is still out. But I agree with you that the King of Jordan has really done a job of holding the country together.
Great job. A great job he's done.
We have anybody else?
Yes, there are other questions.
I lived
Muriel Anderson. Oh.
I lived on King Abdulaziz Naval Base near Al Jubail in Saudi Arabia for 3 years. I told my husband I'd follow him anywhere, but not back to Saudi Arabia.
It's not a nice place. And for a while there, by the way, Iran, its imposition of Islam, it's calmed down a bit, but also had a kind of morality police. And it may not have been as vicious as it was in Saudi Arabia, but it was still pretty tough for women. So that's that interpretation of Islam, which has just so suspicious of women and sees them as a, what can you say, as a subversive force and have to be controlled. Religions certainly.
We have another question.
Yeah, Christianity and Judaism have had some of that, but not in the viciousness that we've seen in Islam. Okay, Louise has another question. I saw a hand in the back of the room there too.
I just wanted to say that I have felt that religion and its role, and I'm not talking about any specific religion, but religion and its effects on population has a lot to do in our world of creating some, contributing to these issues that we're talking about.
To me, the group that's been left out are the Kurds. I've always wondered why the Kurds couldn't have a Kurdistan. I think they deserve something like that.
Why is there no Kurdistan? Because they lost.
Too many countries are involved.
It's interesting that the Kurds were complicit in the massacres of the Armenians during the First World War. That they were not organized politically, but they were used kind of as auxiliaries and as freelance bandits who killed lots of Armenians. The thing was that the Kurds had a kind of nomadic society, and those societies had been slow to organize. They're still there. I mean, President Erdogan of Turkey sees them as a major problem. And, it's even invaded Syria in an attempt to fight these Kurdish groups. But your question is, why is there no Kurdistan is really an issue. Why do some national groups succeed and some not? They are there, they have a problem. And, we are very sympathetic to them. Our newspapers are very sympathetic to them because we see them being oppressed. I can just tell you that a lot of these national groups, when they get into power, are not necessarily nice guys. You see it in Armenia, you see it with the Taliban. The Taliban, in some people's eyes, could be considered freedom fighters, right? They're trying to free Afghanistan from Russia or American imperial rule. And I wouldn't call them great for the population. So why they didn't succeed, I'm going to leave that up to Don to tell us about in the next court section.
You'd be surprised.
Almost about out of time. We can take another question or comment. Okay, well, thank you all. It's been, I find this class to have been very interesting for me as well. And there, lots of the things are kind of superficial. How can you deal with a whole country in a short time? But I did think it was useful for us to look at where does the modern Middle East come from? And that's really what this course was about. How did what was a great empire all of a sudden become a hotbed of really world issues? I thank you all for listening. I thank you for your questions.
Thank you.
And the last thing, I'm going to read, I have a little bibliography, but just send me an email. I can suggest some books to you. But thank you all.